it's his way of saying, I made the first move that night after the fire. Like, I showed you that I was interested. And now I need you to reciprocate that and confirm that if we're ever going to be together.
The first 3 words really describe how he feels about Bertha to me. Pain, shame, ire.
Yeah.
Hurt by what happened. He feels ashamed of the situation that he is in, and he's so angry. And Bertha's the only person he can take that out on.
Lillian, hello. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am also great. Right before we recorded this, I read the last chapter of this section that we're going to be talking about today, because I read it really fast, as you know, and then you were like, whoa, I haven't even started this part yet. So then I was like, okay, well, I need to save the last chapter of this section for right beforehand, so everything's fresh in my mind. I went back and reread everything that I had made notes on before, and so now I am all zip, zap, zoop, ready to go, talking about section 3 of Jane Eyre, the novel. So I'm excited.
Hey, that's very exciting. I also just finished the chapter, but I, on the other hand, was the one being like, Piper, you read that in like 2 days. I need more time.
I predict this might be my favorite chunk of all of the sections. I mean, I don't know yet if the next section where we get all of the proposal and all of the big romance stuff, that might obviously steal the show. But there was so much in this that I really liked that was very Rochester heavy, very much in Jane's mind about how she feels about him. So it was very fun to explore.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I am anticipating the next section being the section that I like the most, because I found some parts of this somewhat annoying, but I also really loved the Jane Rochester long talks. Like, I think this section had a lot of what we have sort of anticipated as there being more fleshed out portions in the book versus some of the adaptions that we watched, where like those long conversations, you obviously can't include that in a movie without it seeming insane, but it's lovely to read in a book. And one of the things that I wrote down, and we'll definitely talk about this more, is there's a couple times in this where I'm like, this would be so insane if you didn't know that, like, this story would seem so insane. Like, this man seems crazy if you don't know what he's talking about.
Seriously. It's one of the early notes that I make, because we open up with a section where he is telling Jane about Adele's history and like why, seeing her in that dress upset him so. So he's like, they're walking outside and he's starting to tell her some of the secrets of his mysterious past. And he does again, kind of like we talked about when he's speaking to her before the fireplace, where we predict that he's had 3 glasses of wine. And so therefore he's like maybe just a little buzzed and kind of rambly. But here, presumably it's a new day. I assume he's not drunk or intoxicated. So he's just pontificating. And I wrote down, I'm like, this is a man with a lot on his mind.
Yeah.
So
if it was now, I would say, dude, maybe not talking to your governess, consider therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, seriously. Which is a good point. He's totally using her as a therapist to be like, hey, I really need to tell somebody. And there's even a section that he says, he's like, why, like, so odd that you are the one that I'm telling this to. But he's like, oh, but I know you. I trust you. You're innocent, so I can't corrupt you with my story. But I mean, you're pure in that way. Like, you are uncorruptible. And also you'll keep my secret and blah, blah, blah. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for our listeners who maybe are listening to this going, great ladies, but what are you talking about? Like, what section of the book are you talking about? Which I can't believe that you didn't re-listen to all of our book chapters right before this so that you were ready to go. Which if you did, gold star, it's in the mail. I'm intuiting it that you did this. If it doesn't come, it's because the post office lost it. Ugh,
yeah.
What a bummer.
Not our fault.
Not our fault at all. So we left off at the end. We read for today chapters 15 through 20. So we start with that scene that you were talking about where Rochester is sort of justifying his actions from the night before, where he said he was going to explain more about why he was kind of such a dick to Adele when she was just wearing a pretty dress. And he does do that, which is what a man saying he's going to explain later and then explaining later. And then shortly after that, I think we were all shocked when there was a fire in the middle of the night. And Jane woke up, saved Mr. Rochester, and then he immediately left, only to come back with a bunch of guests and insisting that Jane join the guests every night. And then there's a whole gypsy thing, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And then Mr. Mason shows up and he gets attacked in the middle of the night. And we ended with Mr. Rochester speaking very cryptically after they had sort of whisked Mr. Mason away without any of the other guests knowing about the attack in the night.
Sort of cryptically, but also rather blatantly. Like, I will save that for the end. Let's talk about this chronologically. But my God, if I'm just imagining this as he's like staring at Jane, he's like, someone could save me, Jane. It's like, she's like, is it Blanche?
He says, is it Blanche? But again, we'll talk about it later. I do have one bummer. So we're going to do it right here at the beginning, right at the top, so we can just talk about it and then move right along. So something that is referenced frequently in the book, it's been sort of alluded to prior to this and is very heavy in this section as we're introduced to a bunch more people, is something that is, I'm going to say off the top, is not at all remotely based in any sort of science and is deeply upsetting and racist.
Yes.
Which is the study of phrenology. So phrenology was the definition, according to Google, is a pseudoscience that involves measuring of bumps on the skull to predict mental traits. It's based on the idea that the brain is an organ of the mind and that certain areas of the brain locate certain functions or modules. So basically the idea is you can look at somebody's head and their features and tell if they're smart or creative or kind or cool or whatever. There's obvious problems with that.
Yes.
Which is racism. And it was obviously used to do that. You cannot tell who a person is just by looking at them. And there's a lot of the vibes that I got from this whole section it was very like, I don't want to equivocate astrology and phrenology because they're not even remotely the same, because one is like a fun thing that I enjoy like reading about, but I personally have no ties to. And the other is a tool that was the predecessor to eugenics, which I'll talk about here in just a second. And then I swear to God, we'll move on.
Oh my God. Do we need to talk about eugenics on this podcast?
Just so fast, because it does really, really matter.
Oh my
gosh. Because
I
couldn't read this without, when we're reading it the way that we're reading it, where we're going to discuss it and we're looking into it, you have to call that shit out because it does really, really matter. But the way that Jane talks about it in this book, it feels very much like when there's two different astrology girls who are both very into astrology, but they interpret it in slightly different ways. One astrology girl is like, ugh. And Blanche was like saying all of this stuff about people's phrenology, but she was so wrong, because the kind of phrenology that she does isn't real, but the kind of phrenology that I do is real, which phrenology was something that Charlotte Bronte was very into. I don't know a lot more about it than that, but it was definitely harmful, but it was definitely the lighter, it was a softer kind of bigotry than eugenics, which is a very hard kind of bigotry. So eugenics is essentially like, eugenics people went, phrenology is not science, guys. We need to make it a science. And so eugenics also is absolutely not a science. It was genuinely used to perpetrate horrendous crimes. I'm going to read the quick definition again off of Google about eugenics, knowing that phrenology, which is this harmful thing that we're talking about, directly led to eugenics. So eugenics is a method of, quote, improving the human race. It is definitely discredited and unscientific and is racially based during the 20th century, and it was eventually adopted by the Nazis to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups. It was also used to justify slavery, like kind of as like a retroactive, like that was okay sort of thing, and a bunch of other like horrendous human rights violations.
Mhm.
So that's the reason why it matters so much that we call this out. This is not like a cool way for her to describe faces.
Mhm.
This is an incredibly harmful system of beliefs that I
Mhm.
don't think I genuinely don't believe that Charlotte Bronte is writing this going, and that's why Black people suck. And this is why we should round up all the Jews. I think she's trying to make it like a cool way to describe her characters and make it so that their external looks reflect their internal whatever and add layers of characterization to her characters. I
Mhm.
think it's incredibly problematic and definitely, definitely not okay.
Yeah, agreed with everything you said. I'm sure she was in kind of this little bubble of
Mhm.
information that she had around this, and I don't think she was thinking of other races at all. She was just thinking of like the white people that she knows and the white characters
Mhm.
that she's writing, and so she's like, "Oh, well, I'm going to give him like an intelligent forehead and other shit like that." And it's just like, okay,
Mhm.
whatever. But yeah, so definitely problematic stuff that I think she was just using kind of blindly, but
Yeah, I mean, we can't know for sure whether or not she was using it hatefully or blindly. I
mhm.
also, based off of the very little we know about her, would say that it was most likely blindly. It was most likely from a place of ignorance rather than malice. The other thing, too, is like I don't like well, it was a different time. So people were allowed to be racist then. That's
Yep.
not true. However, it was an incredibly popular thing at the time. So it's not like she's going out of her way to introduce some hateful whatever
Mhm.
to a group of people who've never heard of this.
Mhm.
She's speaking to people in a language that they understand. She's referencing something that was like incredibly common at the time,
Yeah.
which again doesn't make it okay, but
Mhm.
does mean that she's not like perpetuating something brand new. She's
Right.
speaking about something that at the time was very, very popular.
Right. So the modern reader at the time would see her describing these features and get ideas about the character that she would want them to get.
And would have
Um,
taken it with the same level of seriousness that
yeah.
I would take an astrology comparison. However, not with a level of hate that an astrology comparison, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have. So
But now that we've
that's
addressed
the
that,
end of Lillian's phrenology section. I am a little bit sorry because I don't like to bum you guys out, but I'm also not sorry because it's important that we read things critically.
it is.
Let's talk about the cute, sweet boy and
Yeah.
how much I want him to do the kisses.
Okay, so my first notes right off the bat when they're walking through the gardens or whatever the next day, and he's doing this long sort of admittance. You know, he's talking about this affair that he had with Adele's mother, and he's describing all of these things. One thing that I wrote down here that struck me is his decision to tell Jane the truth about this, even though just later on he says, like, how strange that I'm sharing this to you. I think it's sort of like a subconscious, like, like admission. But I think it's sort of him acknowledging that he wishes he could be truthful with Jane. And I think that's important to see up front for his character. He's like, I want to be honest with you, but he can't tell her his really big secret. So he can tell
Mhm.
her his minor secret of, hey, I went to Europe and I like banged this lady and I gave her lots of stuff, but then she made fun of me and slept with another guy. So I shot the dude in the arm and I threw her out on the street. And then later she's like, oh, here's a kid, it's yours, and all this stuff. So I think that's what stood out to me. I think he partially wants to get it off his chest because he has all of these secrets, which I think lead to him rambling in the way that he does. But then also, I think it's his kind of way of trying to be like, I'm trying to be honest with you, Jane. I'm trying to give
Mhm.
you a bit of a understanding of me.
And it also gives him an opportunity to discuss his baggage without revealing that bigger secret, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so funny that this is his less big secret, right? Like he knows that this is a huge scandalous secret that he doesn't discuss with most people. Like this
Mm-hmm.
isn't something that is like openly known and talked about. It's probably some we've seen in some other adaptions. Specifically, the '70s one comes to mind where the group is dancing and they're discussing Adele's likely parentage and stuff, but people don't know the truth of that. And they would never ask him the truth of that. But
Mhm.
there aren't forever consequences
Right.
to,
Yes.
I mean, other than Adele, who he can sort of bring in and be like, she's my ward.
Mhm.
But even that, he explicitly says, Adele is not my child.
Which
And
I have lots of notes about. I think we should discuss whether we think this is true or not. Because so here's the things that like really stood out to me. I was really closely analyzing that because I will say going
Mhm.
in, I personally want him to be her dad because to me
Aw.
that's really cute and like for him caring for her, and even if she isn't his blood relation, it's still sweet that he's caring for her. But so like some of the things that so on page 170, he's kind of talking about this. And he says, "But unluckily the Varens 6 months before had given me this Filetti, I'm not sure if I said that right, Adele, who, she affirmed, was my daughter, and perhaps she may be." That's a line that's there. That stood out to me.
Mm.
"Though I see no proof of such grim paternity written on her countenance, Pilate is more like me than she." Later on in that passage, he says, "Nor do I now acknowledge any, for I am not her father." And it goes on, and there's other things like that. A few things I want to like point out. The fact that he mentions, and perhaps she may be. So there is this chance there that she is
Mhm.
his actual child. And I love that what he follows up with of his reasoning of why she isn't is because she's such a happy, carefree girl and he's so
Aw.
burdened by his sadness and identifies with his sadness as part of like who he is that he's like, she couldn't be mine because she's happy and untroubled like I am. And so that's a really interesting detail.
I want to talk about that
Yeah.
because that's so sweet.
Hmm.
That idea, I read that and I didn't read that part as closely because I sort of thought that he was being a dick and doing what he talks about a lot with Adele, which is like she's just sort of like vapid and not that smart. Like,
Hmm.
but the idea that it's her joy that he doesn't identify with,
Yeah.
that's who I'm going to read it from now on. That's so
Yeah.
sweet. Well, I know you have
Yeah.
another piece here that you wanted to talk about, but I just wanted to specifically say you do. I like that.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I like that too. And there's like other stuff later on that kind of goes to talk about like that and the way that he feels about it. There's a
Mhm.
passage later where Jane is just sitting with Adele and she says, "I sought in her countenance and features a likeness to Mr. Rochester, but found none. No trait, no turn of expression announced relationship. It was a pity. If she could but have been proved to resemble him, he would have thought more of her." And again, I'm thinking to myself now where there are plenty of people who don't, they resemble one parent over the other. So if she
Mhm.
is his actual child, then she probably just like, looks exactly like her mother, which he has said.
Mhm.
He sees her and he's like, wow, you're a tiny version of this woman I was in love with. So it could be simply, that she doesn't have a lot of his features, but she could still be his child. But what I go on in interpreting this, because again, like I want this to be true. So I have here, he says that he's not her father, but it's in Jane's reply that to me confirms that he is, because when she's talking about, he's like, now that you know the truth about her, you're going to like cast her aside. And she says, "I have a regard for her, and now that I know she is in a sense parentless, forsaken by her mother and disowned by you," which to me, the use of the word to disown someone is typically only
Mhm.
used amongst family. And so I want to
Mhm.
believe that she is. And again, there's no confirmation apart from he has decided that she's not his child, but she could be.
Yeah, I think the question mark there, regardless, like regardless of whether or not she is or isn't, the fact that it's unclear, that I almost feel the opposite of what you're saying. I agree that it would be cute and I can see that, but I think I almost like reading it more if we see it the way that he sees it, which is I don't think she is.
Hmm.
Because regardless of whether or not she is, he still took her in. Like
Yeah.
he does at a minimum, he doesn't think that
Yeah.
she's his daughter.
Hmm.
And the fact that he doesn't like her mom. He thinks that
Hmm.
her mom is sort of a garbage person. And we see like the flow of that from like being brought in by her charms and her beauty to being and like real like seeing in that moment when she's cheating on him, oh, she's actually terrible and I immediately don't like her. To then like know that about her and know that he like has this child, he like thought this child was his and then he decides that it's not his child. But as soon as Adele needed someone, he showed up
Yeah.
without question and
Hmm.
took her in. And I think it's the same thing we talked about with the vulnerability of her and Mrs. Fairfax when we were
Hmm.
first talking about like he acts like he's this asshole and he behaves like an asshole
Yeah.
frequently. We
Mhm.
see a lot more of that man in these chapters. But I think the fact that he took her in despite believing that she's not his, that
Mhm.
makes me like him more because particularly at this time, like no one in that society, even if there was a 90% chance that it was his child, but there was a 10% chance it wasn't, if she
Mhm.
slept with one other person one time,
Mhm.
then he has no responsibility for that child. Like no one thinks he should have to take that child in.
Yeah.
And he does it anyway, risking social pariah, like being a social pariah because of it. Like
Mhm.
everything he did was considered okay in the society, not talked about, but okay. Like having an affair with a French opera singer is fine for a
Mhm.
man in his station. Like you're
Mhm.
allowed to do that. You have no responsibility for those children. And
Mhm.
and if you think that's not your kid, you definitely don't have to take that kid in.
Yeah. I wonder if it's a way of kind of reading. Does Rochester, he longs to be able to care for someone and to have someone care
Mhm.
for him. And so that might be part of it too, of being like, well, I'll take in this child and she'll be affectionate toward me, perhaps. And I can, give her things that make her happy and stuff like that. So maybe that's kind of filling that need for him to some extent.
Yeah. And I also think he doesn't, similar to Jane and how Jane talks about how knowing that this child is unloved makes me want to hold her closer and love her more.
Yeah.
I really think that Rochester's a lot of that same baggage of people did not treat me properly. I did not have the despite having all of these privileges, I didn't
Hmm.
have people who looked out for me and cared for me. I had selfish parents. I had a selfish father and a selfish brother
Hmm.
who did something very manipulative to me to get this thing and it was no fault of mine. So it's
Hmm.
no fault of this child's that
Yeah.
she's in a position where she's been abandoned whether or not she's mine and I'm the only person who could take her, so I will.
Or we get a big chunk where they just kind of talk about the time before the bed fire scene where Jane and Rochester, I feel like, really connect with one another.
Mhm.
And it's that section of story that I have not yet seen in, I think, any adaptation that comes to mind that does it well enough that expresses, okay, for like a couple of weeks, they were just hanging out together. He was telling her stories of his travels and she was
Mhm.
amazed by it. They were growing closer. She has this section that she says, it's on 172. I want to read that as well, where she talks
Can
about
you
how,
reference the chapters as well? Because I do think that the page numbers are different edition to edition, but
yeah,
the chapters are the same.
this is in chapter 15. On my book, it's page 172. And it's what I wrote down here is that Jane's joy is palpable. Like you can feel how
Mm.
much this is affecting her. She says, "So happy, so gratified did I become with this newest interest added to life that I ceased to pine after kindred. My thin crescent destiny seemed to enlarge. The banks of existence were filled up, my bodily health improved. I gathered flesh and strength." And it's this idea that she's like physically becoming like more well. Like she's
Mhm.
gaining color. She's not so skinny and thin anymore, which after he leaves, he comments on that when he stops her on the staircase and says, he's like, "No, you're pale. Have you taken ill?" Like she is literally
Mhm.
physically affected by her time and happiness with him, which is like, could be seen as maybe like you depend too much on this person, but also like she just is someone who's been deprived of love. So of course she reacts this way. But I loved that.
Well, and I also think if anybody's reading Jane Eyre and going, all of these relationships are healthy, I think maybe you have a problem. But I think one of the things that I really love about it is so often Jane is referring to the idea of travel is what she wants, and she wants to explore the world and enjoy the world and go beyond all of these things. And I think often I have experienced a lot of those pieces of life by traveling, and I
Mhm.
love traveling. And I think it's such a great thing that people who are able to should definitely do an experience, but a lot of people aren't able to.
Mhm.
And Jane, in the circumstances that she's sitting in during this chapter, wouldn't be able to. Like, there's not going to be an example where, even though we know Rochester is in love with her and going to sweep her off her feet and wants to take her to Europe and travel and all of that stuff, it's not really possible for her. However, I think this is such a great example that just because travel isn't accessible to her doesn't mean experiencing the world isn't.
Right.
And that finding that truly what she was looking for, that the travel and the desire to like be somewhere else and do something else was really about experiencing life more and
Hmm.
just having that depth of all of those things that she's had. I don't want to say she's had a really shallow experience, but she's only been able to have a shallow experience. And we know that Jane has such a depth of spirit and life and all of those things. So when she's in a space that's very shallow, she's not thriving. And when she gets into this space where she's allowed to be this deeper version of herself,
Hmm.
even though that's through this man, that's really, I think there's other situations where she could be put in a situation where she's able to be her full self.
Yeah.
And that's what's really feeding her spirit. And that's what's really making her like fill out and grow in that way.
Absolutely. I want to punctuate this with another thing that she says just a little further down. I'm going to preface this by saying she's described all this happiness, right? And
Mhm,
she understands that many people associate beauty with happiness. And so she's
mhm.
like, "Oh, like does this mean that you thought he was super sexy and everything?" And she says, "And was Mr. Rochester now ugly in my eyes? No, reader. Gratitude and many associations, all pleasurable and genial, made his face the object I best liked to see. His presence in a room was more cheering than the brightest fire." And it's so
Yeah.
cute. And it like really captures just how happy she is and how I think we can anticipate how happy she will be at the end of this tale when they're finally
Mhm.
together as they should be. So it's very warm and it's very comforting. And of course, as such a good writer as Bronte is, she gives us that feeling before snatching it away.
I think I have another piece within this chapter because there's you and I have talked before getting into this. I think you texted me after you finished reading chapter 15. You're like, we might have a too big of a chunk because I could talk for an hour just about chapter 15. So,
Yes.
specifically, a note on that beauty reference. I think you called out earlier examples in some of our previous book episodes of Jane associating not physical traits
Hmm.
with beauty, but instead people being kind, people being smart, people being
Hmm.
like all these things. And I love that the first description of Rochester is he wasn't handsome, therefore he wasn't intimidating to me. And then
Hmm.
it goes into now that I know him and I have this relationship with him, he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I
Yeah.
think it is that it's the way if you've ever seen a friend in love and you look at the guy and you're like, I'm so, or their partner or whoever, and just be like, this person's, I'm happy for you, but that person is not attractive. And you seem very attracted to them. It's about the connection. And I love that. And I love this being like such a tangible example of like rose colored glasses in the best way.
Oh, yes. La vie en rose.
One other thing that I want to talk about, and it actually loops back to what we were talking about with the story of Celine and the way he kind of goes off rambling.
Hmm.
Something that I caught in this that I don't think we've seen and would be hard to translate into an adaptation is how a chunk of that rant is very clearly about,
Bertha.
there we go. I wanted
Yeah.
to say Blanche, which is why Piper saw my face look panicked,
And
which is
I was
what
like, I
it does.
got you.
Which is what it does when I can't. So anyway, Bertha. It was very clearly about Bertha,
Hmm.
and he specifically says so. The line that Jane is observing. So he's been talking about Celine. He started talking about kind of the difficulties of his life and trying to contextualize this moment for Jane. And he has a moment where he lifts his eyes to Thornfield's battlements and casts them over with a glare such as I have never seen before or since. Pain, shame, ire, impatience, disgust, detestation.
Detestation.
Yeah, there was a hard word to pronounce. Seemed momentarily to hold a quivering conflict. So
Yes.
all he looks up at the battlements, and we as readers who have this dramatic irony of knowing that he's looking up at Bertha,
Hmm.
has all of these emotions come up all together. And I think that this is such a moment of understanding his character, that he has that the first three words really describe how he feels about Bertha to me:
Hmm.
pain, shame, ire. He's
Yeah.
hurt by what happened. He feels ashamed of the situation that he is in, and
Mhm.
he's so angry. And Bertha's the only person he can take that out on.
Yeah.
All of
No.
that anger has to be directed at her because everyone else involved is dead.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that section because I made a point about that too, because it's this interesting reprieve. It's this break in the middle of his story. And Jane has to literally pull him back to it to be like, so what happened when you were on the balcony? And he's like, oh yeah, Paris, I forgot. But it is that interesting thing where just looking at his home, it makes him think of her because he knows that she's there. And
Mhm.
I even wondered, I made a note about this when I went back. I was like, I know he says that he was looking at the battlements. And later he talks, he's like, oh, just like Hamlet, I saw a hag by that tree and it's like imaginary or whatever. And I'm like, I wonder if he glanced up and he saw Bertha in the window or something. And I'm like, what if he saw his wife, the source of his pain, and then is like, oh shit, she's there and she's looking at me and I have to now remember her too. And
Mhm.
so
I
I
wanna
wondered
say
about
it's the
that.
2006 adaptation where they have that red scarf that often
Yeah.
represents Bertha, and that's sort of what I picture where it doesn't need to be something quite that visual in a book, but he's
Mhm.
looking up and whether he sees her or not, he knows that's her window, right? Like, he's looking up towards the battlements. That's what Jane thinks it is because what else would he be looking at? The 3rd floor? That would be crazy. That is what he's looking at.
He has that
No, no, no,
section
go
where
ahead.
he's like talking about how he wants to love his home and he like is gonna like try and
Mhm.
like will himself to love it again, aka like by marrying Jane, but who knows? Yeah. Um
Well, and I think anytime he references Thornfield, you can tell that there's this dual meaning of like, and I think of talking about Bertha and his
mhm,
and all of those things and all the baggage that comes along with that. And I think what this says to me, and especially when you read it with some of the things that we saw in chapter 20, is that he wants to be honest with Jane, but he
yeah.
doesn't want to burden Jane. And he
Yeah.
references that a couple of times in this like rambling that he goes on where Jane has to call him back to the moment to finish the story.
Mhm.
Talks about the idea that he doesn't want to burden her. But like if you, it doesn't seem like that, like it's sort of this roundabout weird way of saying it, but we know that that's what he's saying. It's like he wants to be as honest as he can with Jane
Mhm.
without burdening her. I think is the kindest way to look at it. The most
Right.
cynical way is without being honest with her
Mhm.
and continuing to kind of keep her in this position of like doing what he wants and manipulating her, which
Exactly.
I don't think that's not true. Like, I think that's still true.
Mhm.
I think he's definitely manipulating her. Like anybody who reads this and doesn't see that he's manipulating her, it's whether or not the manipulation is acceptable and justified.
Mhm.
I think if it's again, it's one of the reasons why it's so hard to do a modern adaptation of this. Like,
Mhm.
unlike where a lot of Jane Austen, we see like, oh, well, here's a version of Emma that's actually now in the 80s.
Mhm.
And like, here's a version of Pride and Prejudice that's actually a high school in 1999. Like
Mhm.
all of those things, they can do that with those books because they're not so tied to the societal constraints at the time
Yeah.
in this very specific way that
Yeah.
now you can't translate that ethically.
Before we move on to the burning bed scene, one of my last notes about this, because there's quite a few long passages where it's just simply Jane like going over her thoughts about Rochester and just kind of her inner kind of like thinking about him and her feelings about him and everything. And when I was reading that, it made me kind of long for essentially like a Midnight Sun like book, which redoes Jane Eyre, but it's told from the perspective of Rochester. Because I'm like, I want to hear his inner thoughts to be
Did
like, what does
you
he think of Jane and all this stuff going on that he doesn't say out loud? That would be wild.
have
And to hear his
you
like justification of everything.
do you know that there's at least 2 books that do that?
Oh my gosh, I'm not surprised. So I would totally check those out.
There's I because I was just over the past weekend digging through my most visited Wikipedia page, which is the Jane Eyre adaptation page, which has
Amazing.
a bazillion things on it, including a whole section on books that has like, this is supposed to be a sequel to Jane Eyre. This is supposed to be Jane Eyre from Rochester's perspective. Some of the Rochester's perspective ones have bad reviews.
I
So,
bet.
but I definitely, it's something that we would consider doing. So if that's something that, if you want us, if you have a version of the book that is told from Rochester's perspective and you, really, please, if we're going to read a book, please make it one you liked. I don't want to read a bad book. I'm sorry, guys. We love you, but I don't love you 8 hours of a bad book.
If you've written a fan fiction where it's the
Yes.
retelling with Rochester, send us that. I will so read it I just can't wait. So if you have any Jane Eyre related fanfic, send it to us.
Jane Eyre. Okay, I might not read all the Jane Eyre related fanfic you love, but I would read some of it if Piper pre-screens it for me.
I will.
But absolutely, like if you have a version of Jane Eyre that you love as a book that you think is worth reading, you can send it to us and we'll try. We'll at least look into it because we're movie people, we're TV people more than the genuinely 20 plus books that are considered related to Jane Eyre. Although we do have an author coming on shortly to discuss a Bertha related book, but I'm sure we'll tell you more about that in the future.
Yes, we should keep that as a little more of a surprise, but just wet your
whistle. I want to allude to it so you guys know it's coming. Get excited.
So, are you ready to talk about the burning bed scene?
No, I'm not emotionally prepared yet. I need like 6 more weeks.
My first note here, and I wrote this in all caps, Jane puts out the fire by herself.
Yes.
He does not get out of bed until the flames are extinguished. Why do the movies make him like mostly do it with her? It's like, no, it's way better if she's like, bitch, I just saved you. And he's like, bitch, you just saved me. Like, that's how it should be.
Yep. Yes. That is also my first note. I wrote it so big on the top of that page. I was like, Jane saves him. He doesn't do shit.
Yes, he just lays there in a puddle and he's like, is there a flood? Like, why am I all wet?
Here's the only justification I can think of for the adaptions. All having him wake up and save himself a little bit, mostly. A lot of them have him do it mostly. Is that how could he have slept through her pouring 2 pitchers of water and then running back to her room to get a 3rd pitcher of water and then pouring a pitcher, all of which would have hit him, right?
Yes.
So like, I get that the logistics of the situation are easy to ignore in a book. And if you watched a man sleep through a fire in his bed while he gets hit by 3 pitchers of water, it would probably not work out. However, you could absolutely make some minor changes to the way the fire happens so that it's just a fire in the room, or it's only half of the bed that's on fire and it's not the half that he's in. There are tons of other ways to change the story where Jane is still the one putting out the fire. Every adaptation makes it so that Jane wakes him up and then he puts out the fire.
Or they do it together.
Fuck that shit.
I know, seriously. My only thing that I can think of like why he wouldn't have gotten up is because as we see in many versions, the room is like full of smoke. So he might just be kind of like partially unconscious from smoke inhalation. So that might be part of it, that maybe it's just taking a long time for him to cough all the smoke out of his lungs.
Absolutely. And I think there's lots of ways to justify why he would stay asleep. I think it's lazy, and we've talked about the idea that a lot of the adaptions are products of other adaptions. And I think it's what's been done in the other ones. And if one happens again, if we hear it, first of all, I'm out here on the lookout. We are due for a new Jane Eyre adaptation. I'm keeping my head on a swivel because it's been 11 years since the Fassbender one. So we are due for a Jane Eyre adaptation. And when I hear those little rumblings in the distance of a Jane Eyre adaptation, I'm sending them a letter and I'm telling them that if I swear to God, if Jane doesn't put out the fire by herself, I will pick it. I will stand outside all alone in my Kmart parking lot. And I will be so mad.
I thought you were going to say you were going to write them and be like, I demand that Piper and I be invited to the premiere.
I mean, that's obvious.
Yeah, doy.
That's sort of like the PS. Like, PS, I'm so excited that you're doing this. I would love to come. We have this whole thing that we do.
Amazing.
but also if you fuck up the burning bed scene, I will never forgive you.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm gonna do some more. There's gonna be a lot of passage reading for me in this one because these are like so important. Are you ready for this, Lillian? The stuff that he says to Jane. So there, all this stuff happens. He wraps her in his cloak. She sits there. He comes back. I love his whole like. He's like, you probably saw something, right? She's like, no, I heard a laugh, and it's this. And he's like, yep, you guessed it. Dodge the bullet there. Don't have to admit anything. But then he has, this cute like romantic moment with her when he's like, you should leave, and she's like, okay, I'll go. And he's like, you're gonna leave me? Really? Like just like that, you're gonna quit me? And all the beautiful stuff. The passage that I need to talk about here is when he says, I knew, he continued, you would do me good in some way. At some time, I saw it in your eyes when I first beheld you. Their expression and smile did not, again he stopped, did not, he proceeded hastily, strike delight into my very innermost heart, so for nothing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like he, for me, the way I read that is I'm like, he's afraid to admit his romantic feelings. He's like, do I dare mention my innermost heart, which will surely say to her that I love her. And he's like, fuck it, I'm gonna do it. Like, yes, like you mean a lot to me. I've liked you since the beginning. I'm so glad you're here. Oh boy. That was like the first kind of like admittance. And that's a big deal.
Yeah. It's so sweet. And I have another thing that I want to reference there towards the end, but within that speech that you're talking about, I think something that I don't know I've ever picked up on before. And I think a lot of this after the fire is out, most of this scene is fairly true to what we see in a lot of the adaptations. Those are pieces of that speech we've seen in other adaptations, although not quite as lovely. But I think one of the things that I started to question in this that I haven't in the adaptations is I am kind of reading this scene as him inviting her to stay with him.
Oh, totally.
And I think
he's like, let's have sex. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think he wants her to have sex with him. And I think if she did in that moment, he would have had an affair with her and they would have just had this love affair.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to me adds this layer of, okay, so now like you're saying, like, let's put ourselves in Rochester's shoes. Let's say that he, with a lot of opportunity for her to say no, tried to get this woman to agree to an affair with him, and she chose to walk away. Mm-hmm. So he's sitting there himself in his room being like, I love Jane. She is so smart and I like talking to her and I want to give her kisses all the time, but I can't give her kisses all the time because she's not my wife and it's olden times. And you can't just give kisses to people who aren't your wife. Jane should be my wife. We should do kisses all the time. Well, I can't just marry my governess, plus I'm already married. and then he's like, oh, I love Jane so much, I would do a bigamy and I wouldn't have to tell her. What a great idea, self. You did it. But what if Jane doesn't love me? Like, she did just turn me down to have an affair. Maybe she doesn't love me. I have to figure out if she really loves me first. I know. Ever Rochester, you genius. I'm going to go and get this pretty lady and I'm going to pretend that I'm in love with her and I'm going to say Genghis jelly. Also, I might do some costuming at some point and do a little drag. But really, I think figuring out if she loves me the best way, not be honest with her about my feelings, because that's a big risk. But instead, go find somebody else to do smooches of in front of her.
Okay, first of all, that should be our adaptation. It's just Lillian being Rochester's inner monologue. And like how he like rationalizes his decisions.
Ever Rochester, you genius.
You genius. Oh my God, I loved that, Lillian. That was so good. But yes, no, like, okay. Yes, no, okay. The thing here that we have to, with like his mindset about this is, like you say, she just turned me down twice. Mm-hmm. Do I dare, put forward my emotions? I think to someone who is more kind of worldly and experienced in the ways of romance, like Rochester is, it would be pretty obvious that when he's holding her hand there and they're standing in the bedroom and everything, and he's like, really, you're gonna go? Like, aren't we gonna, like have some kisses and some fun touching and all that good stuff? But she, innocent. Yes, and fun touching. And she like innocent and sweet and very, like holy and pious or whatever is like, I should not be in this room with you when we both are this hot and bothered. And so, it is. Because before in the chapter, we didn't talk about in chapter 15 is when he introduces, this idea of like, have you never known jealousy, Jane? No, of course not, because you've never been in love. And so he puts that 2 and 2 together and says, maybe that's the way without, making a fool of myself in front of this girl because she already said no 2 times to my
Mhm.
sexual advances or implications. I can get her to confess without, talking about it with this jealousy ploy. So it is interesting the way this kind of like builds and evolves from that kind of first seed that's planted, and then he's like, "Oh, let's maybe keep on going with this."
Yeah, and I think the thing that I'm curious about with that moment and knowing that he's trying to sleep with her, which I don't know if that's just my little innocent brain being like, I don't know, he didn't say, do you want to have sex with me? So I guess he didn't. Like I think maybe Jane read it the way that I read it, which is like, that was awfully scandalous. We held hands. Oh, but maybe not being like, oh, he was asking me to have sex with him.
Well, so let's like pick up though on some of the details that she picks up on herself.
Yeah.
So after he says that, she then says, "Strange energy was in his voice, strange
Ooh.
fire in his look." And I'm like, he's got a fire in his eyes, Jane. You know what that means.
Eee.
Then when she goes back, there's this passage here which I think is really interesting, where she said, "I regained my couch, but never thought of sleep. Till morning dawned, I was tossed on a buoyant but unquiet sea, where pillows of trouble rolled under surges of joy." And it is this like interesting, like, how does a repressed virgin express her horniness? Like, is that it? Like, is she being like, that was way too hot, I can't sleep now? Like, who knows? But she at least is aware of some of this like sexual tension, I think.
Yeah. I think she's aware of the sexual tension. I think she's aware of there being something like heat there, but I
Mhm.
don't know that she's aware of the possibility of having an affair with him. Like, I
Right.
don't think she understood that as an invitation to have an affair with him.
Right.
Which I think you can lay a lot of this stuff out that's been happening as Rochester being like, I would definitely have an affair with you. And
Mhm.
I think in some ways, it's so lovely that he kind of came to the conclusion after this fire that he doesn't want an affair with her. He wants to marry her,
Yeah.
which is a different level of commitment and means so much. And it sucks that he can't
Mhm.
legally and ethically marry her in this time.
Mhm.
But that's such a beautiful thing that he doesn't want part of her. He doesn't it's the thing that he says in that stay speech that that is either in the book or I'm going to burn it. Um which is I don't want to make it be I don't want to go like too far, but I'm going to become a book burner even though I don't believe in that sort of stuff and I
Oh my
love Jane
god.
Eyre. If they don't have the line of wanting not he could make her stay but he wants her mind, not just her
Mhm.
body. I think that this is another example of that. He wants her to be his wife.
Yeah.
He wants them to have a life together and he
Mhm.
doesn't want a compromised version of that. And he would accept that for himself, but he doesn't want that for Jane. And
Yeah.
he's just unwilling to lay everything out there and risk that emotionally, but he wants to give that to her. And he
Mhm.
knows that he wouldn't really be able to have that, but she could have it. She could have their marriage.
Yeah.
He is under the impression that he could keep this secret forever
Mhm.
and that Jane could have a pure life where he's protected her from all those things. Delusional? Yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but not a bad motive. So she wakes up the next morning. She's like, I can't wait to hear his voice. I'm so excited to see him. This man I love. I'm definitely don't have a problem. I just want to see him and talk to him. And she spends all day waiting for him, and we get to wait along with her. Um, and then we find out he left.
Mhm. But before he left, there's a couple of things, just two little details I need to call out. One, there's a scene where Jane is down in the kitchen and all of the people are talking about getting ready. Maybe it's actually, okay, maybe this is after he's left. But I thought this was so interesting. She overhears the servants talking and they say, I have it on page 193, and says, the servants are like, doesn't she know? And they're referring to
Mhm.
the person who's in the house. And so this says to me that the servants know that Grace has someone she's looking after because they're aware of like, they're like, oh, that's why she's paid so much. She has like, at least they know of some kind of secret.
Well, I think they know the secret because in that line they say she's paid more, but I can't complain. I'm paid well too, and I couldn't do what she does.
Right. Yes. So they know her responsibilities, which then made me think of, because I do believe what you said earlier, that I think
Mm-hmm.
Fairfax is kind of oblivious. But
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like, how would the servants know, but Fairfax doesn't know? And then I remembered that earlier when Jane first gets there, Fairfax says, oh, well, I can't talk with the servants. That would be improper.
Yeah.
So I'm like, maybe she's just that out of the loop because of her own social standards. And I'm like, wow, like, really?
Yeah. It makes more sense to me too. Like, it makes sense to me that the servants who aren't Mrs. Fairfax would be like, I'm not going to just be cool with working in a place where we don't know who that person is who's always laughing up there. And this one servant like never hangs out with us and like never comes takes meals with us
Hmm.
and is like maybe like there's just fires in the middle of the night. Like I'm gonna need more context than that. And then
Hmm.
figuring that out, that makes a lot of sense to me because only one of them would need to know for all of them to know.
Right.
But I agree with you. I hadn't because I was having that same moment of like, wait, no, maybe our sweet little bean does know. And she's just but that point of she doesn't talk to the servants.
I feel like you're going to have more notes about this big section where, the party's going on. I didn't have much to talk about that. Yeah, a lot of it I was like, I don't really care about this. I mean, these characters are important. Obviously, they give us a source of comparison of the sort of society that Rochester despises and what he doesn't want versus what he does want in Jane. So establishing that, I understand the importance of it. But there is, if I can jump to one of the parties where Blanche is like kind of chatting with everybody, there's this scene where she starts talking about how she prefers a not attractive man.
Oh my God,
Um,
yes.
okay, awesome. So she is talking about how she's like, "Oh, men shouldn't be handsome or pretty. That's the lady's job. I wouldn't want to be outshined." And she's like, "Oh, it's better for a man to be manly and tough and not like attractive." And so I think what she's trying to do is she's trying to like acknowledge that Rochester doesn't have classically good looks and tell him that it's okay in her weird way of like flirting, but she's failing at it because she doesn't understand him well enough. We know that Rochester is incredibly vain and self-conscious about his bad looks. And so
Mhm.
so Blanche being like, "Oh, like it's cool that you're not attractive." He's like in his head, I picture him being like, "Ouch, ouch, ouch, you bitch. No, I don't tell me I'm not attractive. I want to pretend that I am." Where in reverse, we have these great passages of Jane, looking at his face and talking about how she sees the beauty in his
Mm,
unconventional features. And maybe that taps a
yeah.
little into some of the like feature stuff that you were talking about earlier that you don't like. But I thought that was an interesting balance of Blanche is like, I'm going to be nice to this ugly man, but I'm like, oh, you just failed. You just lost him there, baby.
Yeah, I think I absolutely think if what we were doing was a deep dive into every single chapter of this book, we could go deep into what each of these characters and all of this stuff. But I think that the most important character that I want to talk about is Blanche. That's a peak Blanche moment. And the first thing that I wrote down here is what a bitch. Oh, I hate her so much. I wrote it in all caps. I wrote it on multiple pages in the book. I oh, what a bitch. Jesus Christ, Blanche. Woof, honey. Try to be like a good person for more than 2 seconds and do it on purpose, not just to charm this man. I hate her so much. I literally wrote down, here's some things I wrote about Blanche.
Tell me.
One, she's so much worse than in the books than in most of the movies. In most of the movies, she gets a really good edit. She is constantly condescending to Adele. Like her little note about puppet, like calling her a little puppet, we can hear from in Jane's head that that is like a sarcastic, shitty line because
Mm-hmm.
they have that in some of the adaptations. And sometimes it's like, oh, what a little puppet, instead of like, oh, what a little puppet.
Well,
Look,
yeah.
I literally wrote, she talks shit about Jane in front of Jane
Hmm.
constantly,
Yes.
which the only version where we see that to a level where like she knows Jane is there and she is saying it so Jane can hear her is the
Hmm.
1957 version, which I thought everything in there was wrong. Apparently, I was wrong. They got Blanche right in that moment.
I feel like there are scenes though, like I feel like the 80s version does that where, she's like just kind of being vapid and like trying to be interesting by being like, oh, like governesses, I tormented all
Yeah.
of mine. How interesting am I, right? Bragging about my
Yeah.
cruelty.
But I think a lot of times she does talk shit about governesses. I think in the book, she specifically talks shit about Jane.
Yeah.
And I agree, the 80s one probably has more of that. The more that we read this book, and then I think about the 80s one, the more that I realize I was reeling from so many of the basic facts of Jane Eyre. Like her boss is sitting on her constantly, and he has a wife locked in an actual attic. I did not pick up on the nuances of that. So I
No
am genuinely
worries.
so excited once we're done reading the book to go back and rewatch that so I can really, really see it as a Jane Eyre adaptation instead of like, what do you mean?
I'm so
Oh, this
excited.
is insane.
We should do a sleepover and just binge it. That'd be great.
Yay, that would be so much fun.
But what
Listeners, you guys are
you
invited in spirit.
Yes, exactly. What you said though there, Lillian, it makes me think the fact that Blanche is so blatantly cruel to Jane. Do we gather that she does see Jane as a threat? Does she pick up on? She must know. Like, as if she's studying this man that she's trying to snare in her honey trap to marry and take his money, she must be watching him closely. And I'm sure she has observed Rochester observing Jane the same way that Jane has observed Rochester pretending to observe Blanche.
Yeah,
So that's
these
probably why she's being so cruel, because she's like, do you care about that lady? Like, she's nothing. Governesses suck, don't you think? It's just like, boy, not subtle Blanche.
yeah, I absolutely think that Jane and Rochester have massive crushes on each other, and there's no way that everyone else in that room doesn't know about it.
Right.
Especially, like, I think some of the like men and some of the women that are like just there to enjoy the party probably aren't noticing. But Blanche is there to get Rochester to marry her. Of course,
Mhm.
she's picking up on that, and of course, that's layers in it. And I feel like they probably have the same energy where like everybody knows, and like Blanche knows that these two have a thing for each other. She
Mhm.
just is like her comments about governesses are partly probably being like, dude, you cannot marry a governess. Do you
Mhm.
understand how powerful you are and how rich you are? And you should be marrying somebody who has connections to a title and has pretty, pretty looks and is able to help you through society and doesn't care that you're ugly.
And I think, yeah, I think that's also kind of, she's trying to bring up the danger of someone of his stature marrying a governess. I think when she references, or someone at the party references, that a governess they had at one point had like an affair with another one of the staff members, and that
Mhm.
like would have been so shameful for the house, so they fired them. And
It was
so,
and it was the girl's governess was
mhm,
having an affair with the boy's tutor.
yes,
And that level was scandalous, and they kicked
right.
him out.
Right. And so they're like, so don't even think about smooching
Mhm.
the teacher that you hire, like, because it'll be way worse than that, Rochester. And he's like, "Pff, bitch, I'm gonna smooch the heck out of that girl. You don't even know."
Uh,
Which,
yeah.
again, on talking about like how obvious it is to everyone there that he is totally into her, when she gets emotional when they're singing their duet and leaves, and he instantly goes after her. Doy, he's into his governess.
I know.
Oh, but that
That scene.
scene on the staircase, he is so tender to her. And again, the way that Bronte writes this is she typically just has these sections where it's just the dialogue, right? We don't get things of like, he looked at her with eyes of longing. You know, we don't have that. We just have the words. And so it's up for the audience to insert emotion based on everything else that we've been given. I read it as him kind of the way that like Darcy talks to Lizzie in
Mhm.
the 2000 whatever movie. That's kind of how I see him when he sees that she's not well and then he's worried about her. And when he leaves, my favorite part is when if I had time, I would know what this is all about. Like I imagine him wanting to like sit her down on the stair and sit next to her and be like, "Sweetie, what's wrong? Talk to me." But they can't obviously. And he almost gives
Mhm.
her a pet name before he leaves, but he stops himself. I'm like, "Oh, it's so cute."
I want to talk about that. I also have one more thing that I want to talk about, and what I've written down, my notes in my book are Piper's redemption, because I found why you thought it was a slipper.
Yes, because she stops to tie
Because
her own slipper.
she stops, and here's the passage because I think it's really important to talk about. So she says, "Thence a narrow passage led to the hall, and crossing it, I perceived that my sandal was loose. I stooped to tie it, kneeling down. For that purpose, on the mat on the stairs." That's why you thought that he was helping her with her slipper.
Boom.
You didn't fully invent it. This
Haha.
was part of the book.
Oh my gosh.
I would like everyone to write letters to Piper apologizing. Nobody actually has to do that because she did sort of say a thing that wasn't true. But I am personally saying, congratulations, you're only half crazy. You're not full crazy like me.
Thank you, Lillian. I appreciate that. In my adaptation, she will be on her way up the stairs, stop to bend to tie her sandal, and then his hands will appear and he will help her tie it, and then they'll look up and meet each other's eyes, and it'll be so dang cute.
And we'll
That's
hear
my.
the voiceover of Rochester's voice going, Edward Rochester, you genius.
Edward Rochester, you slick son of a gun.
It'll be my voice. My voice will always be his. Someone else will play Rochester, but it'll be my voice doing his inner monologue.
Amazing, amazing, amazing.
Well, the last piece here, the very last line of this chapter is him saying, good night, my. He stopped abruptly, bit his lip, and abruptly left. Oh. He was gonna say my love.
My sweetheart.
I just know it.
Oh, Dodo. It's so cute. I personally love terms of endearment. I know they're not for everybody, and for me, they have to come from the right place. Like it's all contextual. Like in a romance, give it to me. It's all I want. I want every single thing to be the guy calling them my love, my darling, whatever. All of that. I love it.
Completely agree. Like I love a term of endearment. I think that's so sweet. And I think another parallel similar to what you were referencing to a parallel between chapter 15 and chapter 20, there's another parallel to this moment where he's cutting himself off because he doesn't want to say the thing. And that's at the end of chapter 20 when they're talking after Mason leaves and he says, he's talking about all this stuff. I'm sure we'll discuss it again, but he says, and I believe that I have found the instrument for my cure in. And then he cuts himself off. And Jane's like, what could he possibly be talking about? And then they come to the conclusion that it's Blanche. I'm like, bitch, oh my God.
I know,
Jane.
dude. God, okay. Again, I'm going to talk about that for a long time. So let's quickly move on so we can get to that point.
The last thing I want to talk about with Blanche specifically.
Okay.
Before we got to talk about the gypsy.
Oh, yes.
Is Blanche is super judgy of everybody. Not a fan. The only person in the story that is judgier than Blanche is Jane. Girl,
she's very mean.
Sitting there judging everyone so hard in your head. And she at least like Blanche's targets are the people who are sweet and just like kind of being little goobers and like don't realize that she's making fun of them. And she's actively trying to get them to do embarrassing things so that she can mock them for that. And that sucks. So it is worse when Blanche does it. But Jane is sitting there judging people and she's like, oh, they were simple, whatever. Like, who cares about that? But here's the reasons why Blanche is a terrible person in every single way and deserves to go to hell. I'm like, okay, Jane, not better.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. It was stuff like that where I'm like, okay, you are very much a 18-year-old girl who's very, like angry at the popular girl in class who has the attention of the boy that she likes. And but again, when we compare the meanness of what Blanche says about like Jane versus the meanness that Jane thinks about Blanche, yes, neither are good, but there's a kind of level of balance where it comes to Blanche has wealth, status, and power, and Jane does not. So her talking shit to people who are of a lesser position than her is cruel, where when Jane thinks mean thoughts about Blanche, it's her way of trying to like kind of protect herself and her fragile feelings of how threatened she is by this person who she assumes is going to take the man that she loves away from her.
And then I think we're absolutely supposed to see the difference in that like it's almost interesting how it's almost as if Charlotte is telling us to we shouldn't be upset about the judgment. We should be upset about who she's judging.
Yeah.
Which I absolutely agree. It's sort of like how with jokes and things, like you have to make sure that you're punching up is the reference where it's like, if you're making fun of someone who has more power than you, more social clout, more control over the situation, then it's not as much bullying, where Blanche is very clearly only taking on fights that she believes she can win, which sucks.
Yes, exactly.
And then a gypsy shows up.
Yeah. So we get that really long and weird version of charades, which we don't need to talk about because it's just like so elaborate.
It makes the 83 make more sense that they included the most insane game of charades.
Yes.
But No, it's not for
Um,
me.
So Rochester is clearly, though, loving the theatrics, and he's like, I could take this a step up. Like, doing charades with my friends to make Jane jealous isn't quite enough. I'm going to pretend to go away on business, sneak back into the house, put on a gypsy costume, and then demand that all the eligible ladies come in and talk to me. And for some reason, none of them will figure out that it's me just because I have soot on my face, which, first of all, inappropriate, and
I
also
know.
like have dressed in drag and am shadowy and doing a funny voice. And it's like, wow, these people are idiots.
Yeah. And there's so many things in the description of Rochester as the gypsy that are not okay. But you mentioned there's something that you actually mentioned on a previous episode, which is Rochester's just a little theater boy.
Yes.
And I think that like you had referenced that right before we started reading this, I started reading this chapter. So I kept being like, oh my God, he's such a little theater boy. Because an example from like earlier in this section was when he's telling the story about Celine, he like has this whole moment where he like pulls out a pipe and lights it. And it's very much like, I was in Paris. Like, when I lived in Paris, picture me, a young lad in Paris, finally out there on my own, and I found a beautiful woman and fell in love. Like,
He's the theater kid in the trench coat who's like, he's like, let me just tilt my fedora real quick while I tell you this tale. It's like, oh God, come on.
let me set the scene. Big cloak. And you see that in the way that he plays the charades. You see that you absolute theater boys who's doing the gypsy moment,
Yes.
which we've talked about previously. Gypsy is not an acceptable term to use. It's not okay. But I also don't want to associate Romani people with
The bullshit
this
that this
man.
man is doing. Yes. So, of all of the stuff that we get out of that scene, the thing that I kind of took away that I thought was interesting, of like, again, I'm always kind of trying to justify Rochester's, or at least to get into Rochester's mindset to understand like how he justifies these actions. And so, what I wrote down here is that Rochester, as the gypsy, is essentially saying to Jane, because he's like bringing forth all these things that he knows about her. He's like, oh, you have these feelings, right? Surely there's someone you like. It's his way of saying, I made the first move that night after the fire. Like, I showed you that I was interested.
Mhm.
And now I need you to reciprocate that and confirm that if we're ever going to be together. And it really made me think of stuff that we talked about in Pride and Prejudice, where
Mhm.
because Jane, that's the blonde sister, is also a Jane,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because Jane is so shy, she does not express her feelings to Bingley. And everyone says if she doesn't let him know that she's interested, he's going to get out of there because he can't be made a fool of going after this lady who doesn't care about him. So it made me see similar parallels of that. Rochester obviously chose a weird way to go about it by dressing up and doing a voice, but I think it's his way of saying, he's like, Jane, do you like me? Like, I know you like me. Can you please say it? Like, I want to go forward with you with this. Because again, even after he rips off the costume, it's essentially as if he did have that conversation with her. So it's like now these cards are on the table.
Yeah. I mean, Rochester, whenever there's a normal option and a weird option, always goes with the weird option.
Yes.
He's That's the choices he's making. He's sort of just like out there being a goober, which is fine.
It's that
It's not
meme.
fine, but it's fine.
It's that meme with it's Drake, right? Who's doing the no and
Yeah.
the yes point.
Yes.
Yeah, where where he's like, tell Jane my actual feelings. No, dress up in drag and make her confess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just wild. And there's some other moments within there that we could unpack but won't, just in the things that he says to her. But I completely agree with what you're saying. I don't think the gypsy scene is super justifiable. I
No.
think it's very gross. I think that there's some pieces around that are interesting. But I'm never sad when it's not in an adaptation, and I'm not more sad now. I don't feel like there's anything huge that we're missing from that. And I think there's better ways to use the time in the story than having this problematic scene.
Totally. When I was reading all of his dialogue as this gypsy character, I was literally hearing Timothy Dalton's like old lady hag voice in my ear. So I was like, well, that's fun.
Oh, it's such a bad time. Anyway,
So
one other note kind of surrounding the gypsy, and then we'll talk about Mr. Mason. So we see a lot of Blanche when Mr. Rochester is not in the room, showing more of her true colors and being a garbage person.
Yes.
And so when he goes off to run his errands, AKA dress up like a gypsy and come back, we see Blanche just like being that shitty popular girl where she's just trying to get everybody to do what she wants. And she sort of like is just declaring to the room that she's bored and like do what I feel like doing. And when I can't remember, is it Sam? Is that the servant's name who comes in?
I think so.
We're gonna say Sam. And I'm gonna picture in my head your fiance.
Nice.
So when your fiance walked into the room and said, there's a gypsy outside who really wants to come in and read everybody's fortune. And they sort of all react with like, tell her no.
Yeah, what?
Like, actually pretty intense, which that's a scene that's going, if we put the gypsy scene in our adaptation, we're putting the tuck himself into the room scene where we see Rochester being like, no, you guys, you have to let me in. I need to find out if this girl likes me.
Amazing. It's like, wait, let me just peel off this beard and mustache. Look, it's me. Ooh, put it back on.
So still, they come in and Blanche is all on board with that too. She's like, no, send him away. And then her mom goes, yeah, we can't have my precious baby near a gypsy. And Blanche goes, never mind. I actually want her to come in. In fact, I'm going to be the first one to see her. And her mom's like, please don't, my baby girl. And she's like, I can do whatever I want. I'm like, you spoiled little bitch.
I wrote that down. I was like, Lady Ingram talks to Blanche as if she were a toy poodle. She calls her my queenly Blanche, my angel girl. And I'm like, this is literally how I talk to my cat.
It's so upsetting. And then she comes back in, and this is another thing that like maybe it's unnecessary, but it filled me with a bunch of joy. She comes back in the room after seeing the gypsy and is like, it was like fine, like nothing, no big deal happened. And Jane is like, she seemed very upset. She picks up a book and Jane watches her while she doesn't turn the page for 30 minutes.
Yes. I loved that note too. She's just sitting there like pretending to read, like being angry.
And Jane's like, I think maybe you aren't fine.
Yeah. Not very good at hiding it. So Mr. Mason arrives.
Yes.
Richard Dick Mason.
Richard Dick Mason.
Richard Dick Mason shows up. I love how instantly Jane uses that to burst Rochester's bubble because she's like, you big mean jerk. How dare you like try to draw me out in this fashion? And I love when he's like, can you forgive me, Jane? And she's like, I don't know yet. I have to think if I said anything that I should regret. So like meh. But then, yeah, he's there. There's the whole thing where he like turns white and he's like afraid. And he's like, if everyone came and spat at me, what would you do? And she's like, I would stay with you and all that nice stuff, blah, blah, blah. So he shows Mason to his room and everything seems chill until Jane awakes in the middle of the night because she's left her window shade open. The moonlight wakes her up and she hears this blood-curdling scream and a kerfuffle happening in the room above hers, which when I read that, I was like, wait a second. Bertha's room is directly above Jane's room? I'm like, that adds another level to it. Oh, no.
I also, one of the things that I noted down, which is something that maybe I haven't picked up on, but certainly I know in those scenes where we're hearing Rochester say, if everyone spat in my face, would you also spit in my face and kick me while I'm down? And she's like, no, absolutely not. I would kick everybody else out because I'm in love with you, which we do hear Jane say in her head. We've said it for her a lot, but we do hear Jane admit her love for Rochester and sort of try and talk herself out of it several times in this section, which we didn't talk about, but is a thing.
It's when she's like studying him when she thinks he's not looking. I had not intended to love him. There's a bunch of stuff in between. And then she says, he made me love him without looking at me. And it's, so the fact that we hear in her inner monologue talking that she's in love with him, it's something like you've said before, like there's a lot of versions where we don't get the inner monologue and therefore the movie does not accurately portray her feeling in love with him.
Yeah.
The way that she is, and the ones that do kind of don't handle it very well, in my opinion. Like it's a little clunky when in like the 70s version or whatever, we get those long monologues.
When he's saying that, she sees that he looks so aghast and she wants to do anything she can to make him feel better and to get whatever. She doesn't understand what's going on, but whatever it is, she wants to comfort him and help him. And she says, is there anything I can do to help? And he responds with, no, there's nothing you can do. And she then responds with another line that I at least haven't picked up on in any of the adaptations that we've watched. And I'll be looking for it now,
Mhm.
is the line of, well, if there is anything I can do, promise that you'll come to me first. And he
Yeah.
does, which makes it make so much more sense
Mhm.
when there's something to be done that he goes and wakes up Jane, because
Mhm.
I have often wondered, what about this emergency made you need a governess?
Yeah, right, to potentially expose her to your big scary secret.
Where he's thinking, I need somebody and I need somebody trustworthy and I need somebody who's offered to help. And Jane has offered to help. And
Mhm.
and she does so without questioning him, which I don't want to unpack that, but yeah, I think that that's a critical setup to me of like him coming down and being like, everybody go. And Jane knowing to get dressed because she
Mhm.
knows that she's going to need to help, because she just offered to help and he promised to have her come help. And I think that that's also, we talk so often about that equality between Jane and Rochester and the fact
Mhm.
that even though they're constantly being reminded by society that they aren't equals and they shouldn't treat each other like equals, in their heads, they're equals with each other. And
Yeah.
particularly in these tense moments when there's a fire or somebody gets attacked in the middle of the night or something like that, they
Mhm.
lean on each other and she's dressed and ready to go. I
Yeah.
also think this is the third time that we've seen Rochester be in need and Jane be the one helping. And the
Yes.
constant flipping on the head of the damsel in distress. Rochester, what a little damsel you are.
Such a damsel.
And she is always helping him out, which is just lovely.
I agree. There's a couple of moments in these two chapters at the end where we've talked about the importance of the female gaze and what hand holding means and the significance of that. So when Mason first arrives, he, leans on Jane and he has that line where he's like, I wish it was just you and me on an island alone together. There's physical contact there between them. When he goes to collect her to get help, he stops before unlocking the door, asking, are you afraid of blood? Will you faint? And she's like, I don't know. I've never been tested that way before, but I think I'm going to be fine. And he's like, take my hand just in case. And they hold hands as he leads her into this scary place. And I love those little moments because I talked about this. I can't remember which version it was. Oh, I think it was when we were talking about the first section of the book and Helen is dying and there's the description of her like, them hugging and kissing one another and how I think Jane is deprived of physical affection as well as,
Mhm.
verbal and emotional affection. And I think those are very powerful moments to be touched in a kind way by someone you care
Mhm.
about. So whenever that happens in the book, it stands out to me and I highlight it in yellow.
Yeah. I think another line that we've never picked up on the book or in the movie, in any of the adaptions at all, is Jane's internal response to this. And there's no way you could do this in a natural way in an adaptation. And please don't try. The moment her response in her head to him being like, do you faint at the sight of blood? My response has always been, um, what? Like ask follow-up questions. And her response is, she felt a little thrilled. Jane?
She's kinky.
Jane?
She just wants adventure in the great wide somewhere, Lillian. She wants it more than she can stand.
Miss Eyre? No.
So I was disappointed that it is in the book that he commands the two of them not to speak for several hours and they
And it's
obey
in
him.
there so weird. And she
And
doesn't, I kept it, I look, honest to God, one of the things that I was super excited about reading the book, like when we watch all these adaptions, some of the time knowing that we're going to read this book, I'll be like, oh, like, gotta know what's going on in her head when he says that. Nothing.
yeah,
She
nope,
doesn't question it at all.
nope.
He tells them not to talk to each other. He turns to Mason and says, swear to God, if you say one word to her, I will hurt you, sir. And then leaves. And they both just kind of go, and that was normal.
Yeah, no, I think that is the first like really subservient moment I've seen from Jane is her like blind obedience to him at that time.
And the
If
whole way she helps, like even when he comes back and he's constantly just like, go get this, go do that. It's like,
Mhm.
it's demonstrating that he trusts her to do that. But
Yeah.
it's also demonstrating that she will just do whatever he says without question. And I don't like it.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about that either. And it could be read into, at this point, she's just so infatuated with him and maybe caught up in the excitement of the moment so that it doesn't feel like there's time to ask questions. But I feel like what we've seen of Jane so much previously is her communication and the way that she questions things that he says. So here, maybe now, because this is not just like a philosophical conversation by the fire or out by the woods, but it's like a scary thing that's happening in the middle of the night, there's blood, someone is actually in danger, maybe that ease of conversation and questioning is kind of pushed aside for a kind of like immediate fear and like urgency to be like, okay, whatever you need, like if this will get this person to safety, then that's what I'll do. But still, dabbing away blood for several hours in a scary room, I would definitely be like, what happened? Tell me what happened. Like I would totally be talking to that guy.
Or even if you go, this is a crisis, we're going to manage this crisis and we'll deal with that later. Afterwards, they just make lovey eyes at each other, which don't get me wrong, I loved it.
Yeah.
But I also was like, can you just ask like one or two questions about what the fuck just happened?
Seriously. And I guess she assumes that, that she assumes that Grace Poole is doing this. And I guess we do get sort of an inner monologue of her wondering, but the fact that she doesn't voice those concerns or questions is annoying.
She does go, is Grace Poole going to keep working here? And he's like, don't even worry about Grace Poole. I've totally got this under control. Grace Poole is not a problem. And it's like, well, there's clearly a problem. Mm-hmm. Like ask a follow-up question, be like, dude, there's a problem. Am I right? Like, and I don't want to do this 2 times in one episode, but the 57 handled it better because the 57, she's like, no, if you're not going to tell me what's going on, I'm going to fucking leave because there's crazy shit happening in this house and I can't just ignore it. And there was a fire and he immediately left. So they didn't have a chance to talk about it. And she didn't have a chance to ask him about Grace Poole. I get it. That makes sense.
Then she got swept up with sexy emotions.
As we all have.
Yes.
and then there's an attack in the middle of the night. And in the crisis, I get it. You're just managing the crisis. Mm-hmm. I have follow-up questions, but maybe that's what it clicks on in your brain is we're going to manage this crisis and then we're going to deal with that later. And then all you do is ask, what are you going to do about Grace Poole? And he just goes, don't even worry about it. Put it from your mind, baby. I got this. And I'm like, no, I'm going to need more context than that. You're going to have to tell me more about what's happening.
Yes.
Maybe she's 19. And so that was fine with her.
I don't know, dude. Before we wrap up with the big stuff we have to talk about their time in the garden afterwards, one thing I do have to say that I kind of enjoyed that I personally read into is when Rochester returns with the surgeon and he's talking with Mason and they're like vaguely alluding to the attack and to Bertha and all this stuff. The doctor's talking about how like there's teeth marks here and she tore the flesh. And Rochester is like, you should have grappled with her. Like, why did you do this? Why didn't you wait for me? And he has all of these like things. He's like, you fucking idiot. You brought this on yourself. And Mason is over here lamenting, woe is me. I didn't realize things were so bad. I'm in pain, blah, blah, blah. What I really got out of Rochester's frustration and impatience for Mason's suffering is I think he has this annoyance where he's like, dude, like you got attacked once. I get attacked by her constantly. I am the one who carries the burden of responsibility of caring for your sister, a family member that you guys like saddled me with and then fucked off. And so he's like, you don't get to like whine and cry when you come here one time unexpectedly without announcing it and then go up to her without any knowledge about how we care for her or her temperament or anything. And then you're like, oh no, she attacked me. Of course she fucking attacked you. Like maybe like if you took a moment to like wait for me and all this other stuff. So
if only I had told you not to go up there when I wasn't there.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I did.
I did. So I understand his frustration and annoyance. Like obviously he's yelling at a man who's like scared and hurt, but also I totally get why he's like, you fucking moron. Like, so I get his feelings.
You fucking moron is, I think, Mason's whole character.
Yes.
Because we've talked about the fact that there's 2 ways that people play Mason in the adaptions. Either he's a villain who's there to try to fuck with Rochester, 57 peak villain.
Amazing. That's when he's truly Richard Dick Mason.
But then there's other ones where he's just a goober. He's he's so dumb and he didn't need to be there. I think 73 is peak I didn't even know what was happening. Like he shows up in the church and he like looks all like, "Oh, honestly, guys, I thought I was just kind of chatting with somebody. I didn't know this was going to mean you couldn't get married. I was like, sorry, man." Like that's his whole vibe. And then Rochester, the 73's all, "Richard Dick Mason, you dick.
Yeah.
What a congratulations, Dick, on ruining my whole life, Dick. I hope you enjoy the rest of your life, Dick, because all I'm gonna have to do, Dick, is ruin your life, Dick."
Amazing. It's so good. Also, he's like, "You fucking coward, step forward, you bitch." Like he's just hiding in the shadows.
Anyway, but I think we get very clearly in this and in the conversation they have about him afterwards, where she's like, "I don't think he would hurt you on purpose." And he goes, "Yeah, but he's so fucking dumb."
Yes, he's like, no, he'll just open his mouth and ruin everything. That's what's going to happen. So, yes, Rochester and Jane take a stroll through the orchard, and Rochester plucks a flower for her and gives it to her, which is so nice, which I've only seen done a couple of times. I was really thinking of why can't I think of his name? The dude who screams a lot at the end. I want to say Saoirse Ronan, but that's a lady. Like he's got
Syrian Hines.
Syrian Hines, yes, not Saoirse Ronan. Syrian Hines. I kept thinking of his version.
I'm picturing Saoirse Ronan as Rochester now.
Yeah, it's great. We're gonna do it. So he offers her the flower, and what I thought this scene was equally romantic and sweet, but also like really obvious. And obviously, he's just gone through this traumatic evening. He doesn't really have the wits about him to be cool and subtle. But he sits them down on that bench, and he does essentially the thing. He's like, "So I was wondering." No, I wasn't wondering. A friend of mine was wondering, this hypothetical, not me in any way. And he tells this whole story and he's asking Jane, he's like, would it be okay to like, pursue happiness given all these like horrible things? And then he like literally at the end throws the illusion aside. And it's that part that we've been talking about, which I have to grab the passage because he's like, no more proverbs or stories or whatever. Here, he says, "I have myself, I tell it you without parable, been a worldly, dissipated, restless man, and I believe I have found the instrument for my cure in," and there's that like suspended breath. He paused. She doesn't respond. Like I picture him staring at her to be like, "Jane?" Like, and she's just like, and he's like, "God damn it." Because then his like complete demeanor changes. At last, I looked up at the tardy speaker. He was looking eagerly at me. That's the whole thing. And then, "Little friend," said he, in quite a changed tone, while his face changed too, losing all of its softness and gravity, and becoming harsh and sarcastic. "You have noticed my tender penchants for Miss Ingram. Don't you think if I married her, she would regenerate me with a vengeance?" Like, he's like, "Oh my God, really? Like, you're not picking up on this? Fine, we'll keep playing this game." And so, like, that part was so interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I noted down, because I also agree, like right up until that moment, that whole line about the hypothetical and trying to suss out what would Jane think of this? Like, how do I ask her without asking her? Because part of what he's asking her is, do you think this is the right thing? And also, if I like, who's morally responsible for these things? I think we see that in the 97 with Syrian Hines. We've talked about that conversation that they have and the fact that he's asking her without asking her. I think the other version of it is the 1971 when he gives that whole speech. There's a whole paragraph that he gives exactly that speech where he says that, for example, the error, not crime. So he wants to be clear that it's a mistake, not something criminal, or I take from that, not necessarily just like illegal, but like morally wrong. Like they made a mistake and they ended up with consequences from that mistake versus somebody who did something malicious. Like, I think that's the distinction that he's going for. In the 70s version, 7D version, not the 73 one, with George C. Scott, did it the wrong way around.
Saoirse Ronan, George C. Scott.
He says that whole speech, but the difference is, I get it, but I'm over it with Rochester hiding his feelings, because when he starts to talk about Blanche, I'm like, you could have done that right now. And in the 70s version, she doesn't have to go back to Mrs. Reed. That's the next thing that we're going to see happen, is she's going to go back because Mrs. Reed calls her home, and back to Gateshead, not home, because Thornfield is home, babe. And he immediately goes, Oh my God, no, I'm not going to marry Blanche, but I would love to marry you if you're down. Like, if
Hmm.
you would want to kiss me forever, I would want to kiss you forever, which I
Hmm.
assume is in wedding vows, but I'll find out when I go to your wedding.
I personally, now reading that scene, I get it, like, but I now really, really like, and I've always liked this, when adaptations make it so that he does the whole kind of like, it's like, hey, like, what do you think about, the future of me and my happiness in a certain special lady? And I like it when they have Jane be the one who's like, who, Blanche? And he's like, really? You still think that's the case? Like that's
Mm,
the direction I want it to go. And I
yeah.
like when they make that change. Instead of him
Yeah.
then being like, okay, you're not getting it. I guess I'll play along with the Blanche lie. But
Yeah, it's just he's such a deeply insecure man, and
yeah.
he starts with the "I'm just gonna bring Blanche here and then like make you really jealous," and then he talks to her on the stairs and is like, "Are you feeling something?" And she's like, "Nope, I'm not feeling anything. You're totally my boss, and you couldn't marry me if you wanted to." And then later he's like, "I'm not Mr. Rochester. Do you feel anything now?"
Yeah.
And he's like, she's like, no, still my boss, still like nothing can come from this. And then he's like, okay, so somebody was bleeding upstairs for a while and you were hanging out with them. But I really feel like if somebody made a mistake, say, do you think I should get to kiss somebody else, even though reasons? I mean,
Hmm.
no,
Maybe a
nothing. Okay,
certain lady
I'm
who's
going to
sitting with
marry
me in this
somebody
motor.
else.
Yeah, seriously.
I'm going to marry somebody else. How do you feel about that one, Jane?
And it's not, we know this from the other versions. It's not until he finally threatens her to be like, okay, now I'm sending you away to Ireland to be the nanny to 12 weird Irish kids. How do you feel about that, Jane? And she's like, I hate it. I fucking hate it. That's how I feel. It's like, okay, finally, Jesus. Why does it take us
Oh,
this long to admit our feelings?
maybe Bertha wasn't crazy. Maybe somebody kept doing crazy things to her to try to get her to say something. Ugh.
He's like, I just want to know where you want to go out to eat for dinner. She's like, I don't care. You pick.
But no, but he would never say that.
Yeah.
He would dress up like their carriage
Hamburglar.
driver. The Hamburglar.
He's like,
Oh
how
my
do you feel about buns, Bertha? You want some burgers? I'm not Rochester. I'm the Hamburglar. It's okay.
God.
You can tell me.
Oh my God. Oh, that's what our Halloween costume should be. I'll be
God.
Bertha and you be the Hamburglar, but Rochester.
I'm Rochester dressed up as the Hamburglar. Fabulous.
Oh, great. Sam can be Jane.
Oh boy. So, yeah, I feel like that's all the main talking points that I had. Is there any sort of like wrap up reflection on this section that you really want to voice and share before we sort of wrap this episode up?
The only thing is I'm genuinely, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the idea of like, what do we think? Like, do you think this might be your favorite section? I think the next one might be my favorite section. I spent so much of this section being like, kiss, kiss, kiss. Like the way, like, just tell her you love her. And I'm so excited to see what happens when they have that moment when they actually confess their love to each other. I think when it comes to the line of how much do you like a slow burn or not in romances, I think you and I are on slightly different sides of that line, and I'm over it with them not telling each other they love each other.
Oh my gosh. I was just going to say that is I think I love the tension and the buildup. And I personally love looking for little moments where his facade crumbles and like he expresses his interest in her and when that slips through. So that's really exciting for me to see and to follow that journey for him. But yes, I am also excited to see them actually come together. Although I'm worried because like I think this first big chunk is, her going off to back to Gateshead. And I'm like, ugh, I really hope that doesn't take too long. I don't want to spend a lot of time with dying Aunt Reed and her frickin' death bonnet. And because I know from other versions there's a lot more about like the sisters and all that other stuff that she has to deal with her like cousins. So
Yeah.
yeah, that'll be a boring chunk. But then romance. So yay.
Yeah. Well, and so just in case anybody is reading along with us, the next chunk of the book is we're going to be releasing that 3 weeks from when you're listening to this, or if you're listening to this later, it might be out. Go check our website. We do have a whole page on our website called Read Along that has all the different chunks there and what sections we're reading so you can see exactly what chapters it is, because I'm known to say the wrong ones, although I'm 99% these are right. The next chapters we're reading are chapters 21 through 26. We're going to be reading Jane going back to Gateshead, to a dying Mrs. Reed, and then all the way through to their wedding and what happens immediately after the wedding, although not the chapter with sort of the fallout of that. So that's the next chunk of the book. But our next episode that we'll be releasing next week, which is funny to say in June when we're talking about the end of July, and I know time is more fun for us now than it is for you, is the Broadway musical. So we are going to be consuming the Broadway musical. Unfortunately, Broadway didn't just give us a full recording and or time travel tickets to go watch it in the past when it was on Broadway. So the way that we're going to consume this is we're going to be listening to the original soundtrack. So that's going to be sort of the main piece of what we use to talk about it. We're going to be talking about the songs and based off of that original soundtrack. We are also going to be watching a couple of clips. There's some promotional clips and things like that that we can find, as well as I found a full copy of the script. So I don't think I'm going to sit down and read the script, but I anticipate reading around some of the songs to get that additional context of how did they set this up. And I want to do a huge thank you to one of our, at this point, she's a collaborator on the show, which is Kayla Nash, who suggested this to us. She is on Facebook in the Jane Eyre Files group there, and files like PH files like they like it. And her Instagram handle is thundersnow1996, which continues to be a fantastic name.
I'm very excited to dive into this and talk about it in detail. Like I mentioned when we did the 2013 musical, I started listening to the Broadway soundtrack by mistake. So I have now fully listened to the Broadway soundtrack. I have many of the songs frequently stuck in my head late at night, and I'm lying there and I'm like, damn the passion, damn the lies, and I can't go to sleep. So I cannot wait to talk about this and how successfully I think this Broadway production really
Spoilers,
puts emotion. I'm just saying, it's good.
I don't know any. I have been keeping myself clean and pure away from the Broadway musical so that I can have hot, fresh takes for our listeners. And now I'm tainted by your opinion that it's good.
I have been diving into James Barber, and his complete collection of music, the guy who voices Rochester and sings for him. So I am the opposite of that. But that's what makes us such a nice, cute little couple of peas in a pod. In a podcast.
I spend hours and hours Googling random upsetting topics, and you obsess over hot Broadway actors. Damn. Well,
such is life.
On that note, if people want to get your takes on hot Broadway actor via email, they can email us at airbuds@gmail.com. Or if they want to find us on social, they can do that at Airbuds on all of those. And if you have an adaptation in your head that you're like, I really want you guys to watch this or read this or listen to this, we're going to start doing some of the radio adaptations soon. I'm pretty excited about that. Any way that Jane Eyre has been adapted and you're like, I really want the crack team at Airbuds to give us their hot takes, you can see all of the adaptions that we've watched, as well as submit any of your adaptions. You can send in adaptions on anywhere, but if you want to make sure that we haven't already watched it, you can send that in on our website. We have an adaption suggestion page where you can see all of the ones that we've already watched, and there's a little form you can fill out that makes it nice and easy.
Yay. Yeah, seriously, send us your fan fictions. I will read them and then share the best of the best with Lillian. Although there are no favorites, all fan fiction is perfect just the way it is. I want especially the crossover fix. What universe are you bringing Rochester and Jane into? I need to know. But if you love our show and want to help other people find it, right now the best thing you can do is to leave a 5-star review on your app, your podcast app of choice. Share it with friends and family. The more people listening, the more engagement, the more we know that you guys like what we do. So it's the coffee in my cup that gets me up in the morning. So
And
please do.
while we appreciate any feedback from anywhere, we appreciate any level of feedback. Those reviews really do matter, and it really does matter. If you click the 5 stars, first of all, thank you so much. I'm so glad you think we're 5 stars. But if you click a star rating, that's fantastic. We always appreciate that. It does give us quite a bit of a boost if you write a couple of sentences and add an actual review. So we really genuinely super appreciate your guys' time when you do that stuff.
Yeah. But until then, I think that's all we have for you guys today. So thank you for joining us. If you've listened to the long version of this, wow, thank you. And short version still, great. Love you guys. We'll see you next week. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching. Bye.